History remembers the great rulers, the conquerors, the builders, the reformers, but for every Julius Caesar there was a Caligula. For every Marcus Aurelius there was his son. So today, I'm counting down the top 15 most insane ancient rulers. Let's start with number 15, Ibrahim I in the Ottoman Empire. Ibrahim I was born into a cage. That's not a metaphor. The Ottoman Empire had a tradition of locking potential heirs in a sealed section of the palace called the cafes, the windowless complex of rooms where rival princes were kept under guard, cut off from the outside world, watched at all times. Ibrahim entered the cafes as a child, and every one of his brothers was strangled to death by the reigning sultan, one by one. Ibrahim survived only because he was considered too unstable to be a threat. He lived in the cafes for 2 decades under the constant assumption that the next knock on the door was someone coming to kill him. Well, when his brother Murad IV finally died in 1640 and officials came to tell Ibrahim he was now Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, he refused to believe them. He barricaded himself inside his rooms and wouldn't come out until his brother's corpse was physically brought before him as proof. What followed was 8 years of rule that historians still struggle to fully describe. Ibrahim covered the palace walls in sable fur and had cats dressed in sable coats. He sent agents across the empire with specific instruction to find the fattest woman in every province and bring her to the capital. One woman found in Armenia reportedly weighed over 300 pounds and became his favorite. He spent the treasury on perfume, jewels, and furs for his harem. He threatened to stuff his grand vizier with straw when the man declined an order. He had the daughter of the empire's highest religious official kidnapped after her father suggested she decline the sultan's proposal. And then, after a rumor reached him that one of his concubines had been with another man, he had all 280 women of his harem tied into weighted sacks and thrown into the sea. All but one drowned. A French ship pulled a surviving woman from the water. Well, the military, religious, and civil authorities of the Ottoman Empire eventually came together and deposed him. He was strangled with a bowstring 10 days later, still protesting from inside the cages he had spent his childhood in. 2 decades of solitary confinement will do things to a person, and Ibrahim is what that produced. Number 14. Charles VI in France. Charles VI was crowned king at the age of 11, and he took personal control of the kingdom at 21. His subjects called him Charles the Beloved. He was energetic, ambitious, and genuinely popular. Then, in the summer of 1392, while leading a military expedition through a forest near Le Mans, one of his pages accidentally dropped a lance. The clang of metal on the ground threw the 23-year-old king into an uncontrollable frenzy. He drew his sword and attacked his own knights, killing 4 of them before he could be restrained. He had no memory of it afterwards. From that point on until his death 30 years later, Charles experienced at least 44 documented episodes of psychosis. These are periods of weeks or months during which he lost contact with reality entirely. During one episode in 1393, he forgot his own name and didn't know he was king of France. His wife came to visit and he had no idea who he was. He asked his attendants to see what the woman needed and send her away. During a later episode, he became convinced he was St. George, recognized all his officials perfectly but had no memory of his wife or children. The palace entrances were walled up during his worst periods to stop him from sprinting into the streets. In 1405, he refused to wash or change his clothes for 5 months and had to be forcibly bathed by doctors. His most famous delusion, though, was this. He became convinced that he was made of glass. He was terrified that if anyone touched him or if he fell ill, he would shatter into pieces. He had iron sewn into the lining of all his clothing so that a collision wouldn't break him. Well, he forbade courtiers from coming near him, and he moved through his own palace with the slow, rigid caution of someone who genuinely believed he might crack at any moment. His condition is now called the glass delusion, and he is considered the first recorded case. France, meanwhile, lost the Battle of Agincourt, descended into civil war, and signed a peace treaty disinheriting his own son in favor of the King of England. Charles died in 1422, still alternating between clarity and total breakdown, and still occasionally forgetting his own name. Number 13. Commodus, Rome. Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, widely considered the wisest and most decent ruler Rome ever produced, a man who spent his reign on campaign and wrote meditations on virtue and self-restraint. His son Commodus spent his reign in the gladiatorial arena and renamed everything after himself. Rome had seen bad emperors before, but Commodus managed to combine megalomania, narcissism, and a complete detachment from reality in a way that still stands out nearly 2,000 years later. He decided he was the reincarnation of Hercules. He wore a lion's skin and carried a club in public. He had statues of himself as Hercules erected across the empire. He fought in the Colosseum as a gladiator, scandalous by Roman standards, the equivalent of a head of state demanding to compete in a street brawl. He always won because his opponents were not permitted to injure him. He killed 100 bears in a single day from the safety of a raised platform. He gathered all the men in Rome who had lost their feet to disease or accident, tied them together at the knees, dressed them to look like giants, and then clubbed them to death one by one while the crowd watched, because he wanted to reenact a Hercules myth. He also decapitated ostriches mid-gallop with a crescent-shaped arrow, and he walked over to the watching senators and held the severed heads in front of their faces to make a point nobody quite understood. Then he renamed everything. All 12 months of the year were given new names after himself. August became Commodus, October became Herculeus, and so on around the entire calendar. When fire destroyed parts of Rome in 191, he announced that he was the city's new founder and renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodania, Colony of Commodus. Its citizens became the Commodiani, the Roman Senate became the Commodian Fortunate Senate, and on New Year's Eve of 192, his mistress found her name on a list of people he planned to execute. She poisoned his food, but he vomited it up, so they sent his wrestling partner into the bath to strangle him. Well, the Senate immediately passed a formal decree restoring the names of the city, the months, and every institution he had renamed. It took a vote of the entire Roman Senate to give January its name back. Number 12. Qin Shi Huang, China. Qin Shi Huang is one of the most genuinely extraordinary rulers in human history. He unified China for the first time, standardized the writing system, the currency, and the road network, commissioned the Great Wall, and built a mausoleum so huge it took 700,000 people more than 30 years to build it. He was also completely convinced he was going to live forever, and that conviction killed him. The obsession dominated the last decade of his reign. He hated even hearing the word death. Officials learned never to say it in his presence. He installed enclosed walkways between every palace so he would never appear in public and be harder to assassinate. He consulted every alchemist, scholar, and mystic in China about obtaining immortality. One advisor named Xu Fu convinced him the elixir of life existed on a mystical island in the Eastern Sea. The emperor gave Xu Fu 3,000 young men and women enough resources to supply a small army, and he sailed away and never came back. He had almost certainly used the expedition as an opportunity to start a comfortable new life, possibly in what is now Japan. The court alchemists who remained, unwilling to admit that they had no solution and was very unwilling to tell the most powerful man in China they couldn't help him, they settled on mercury pills. Mercury was considered magical in ancient Chinese alchemy, the only metal that stayed liquid at room temperature, seemingly alive. They told the emperor it contained the essence of eternal life. He consumed it daily for years. It poisoned him slowly and killed him at 49. Now, his mausoleum is filled with rivers of flowing mercury. They were found by archaeologists in the 1970s to contain mercury levels 100 times the natural rate. The man who built the terracotta army to guard him in the afterlife was poisoned to death by his own medicine, trying to avoid the one thing he could not conquer. Number 11. Eric XIV in Sweden. Eric XIV, he came to the Swedish throne at the age of 27 as a genuinely capable ruler, fluent in 6 languages, trained in philosophy, music, and military strategy, and energetic enough to manage a kingdom rapidly becoming a major northern European power. He was also convinced from relatively early in his reign that Swedish nobility was conspiring to kill him. This conviction grew until it consumed everything else, and by the middle of his reign he was running his own espionage network inside the court, personally interrogating suspects and ordering executions based on evidence that existed almost entirely inside his own head. The crisis, though, came in 1567. Erik ordered the arrest of members of the Sture family, one of Sweden's most powerful noble houses, on suspicion of treason. During the interrogations, he appeared to have suffered a full psychotic break. He personally attacked one of the prisoners, abandoned the palace, wandered the countryside for days, and returned with no clear memory of what had happened. He then attempted to compensate the families of those he had killed, released prisoners he had been holding for years, and tried to reverse his own decisions, before swinging back into paranoia and issuing new arrest warrants for the same people weeks later. His court watched him oscillate between remorse and terror, unable to predict from one day to the next what the king believed or who he thought was coming for him. His brother Johann organized a revolt, deposed him in 1568, and had him imprisoned. Well, Erik spent 9 years in captivity, lucid enough to write letters and compose music, aware enough of his situation to understand what exactly happened to him, but never stable enough to be released. He died there in prison in 1577. The most widely accepted account is that he was poisoned with arsenic-laced pea soup on the order of his brother, now King Johann III, who had decided that a living former king was simply too dangerous to leave alive. The pea soup recipe Erik XIV was served on the last day of his life is still named after him in Sweden. Number 10. Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar II was the greatest king Babylon ever produced. He defeated the Egyptians, conquered Jerusalem, he razed the Temple of Solomon, carried tens of thousands of Israelites into captivity, and built what ancient writers described as the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. He was a military genius, an ambitious leader, and the most powerful ruler in the ancient Near East. He was also, for a period of at least several years, absolutely convinced that he was an ox. Now, this account comes from the Book of Daniel, written by the Jewish exiles who lived under his rule. As the story goes, Nebuchadnezzar was standing on the roof of his palace, surveying Babylon, the great city he had built by his own power, when a voice came from the sky telling him he would be driven from human society to live with wild animals and eat grass like an ox until he acknowledged a power greater than himself. The words had barely left his lips when it happened. He was driven from the palace, wandered in the open air, ate grass, and was soaked by the dew of heaven until his hair grew like eagle feathers and his nails like the claws of a bird. 7 years had passed before his mind was restored, his kingdom returned, and he praised the God who had humbled him. You know, there is actually a recognized psychiatric condition that describes this, boanthropy, in which a person believes themselves to be a cow or an ox. Whether that happened to Nebuchadnezzar was divine punishment, a genuine psychotic episode, or both, historians still debate. What's harder to debate, though, is the image itself. The most powerful man in the world, the king who brought empires to their knees, crawling through the fields of Babylon on all fours, eating grass while his court waited in silence and the empire carried on without him. He recovered, though. He returned to power and ruled for years afterwards. He apparently learned something from it. Nobody else on this list can say the same. Number 9. Emperor Yozei, Japan. Emperor Yozei ascended to the chrysanthemum throne in 876 at the age of 8. He had a regent, his uncle, Fujiwara no Motosune, to manage the actual business of running Japan. What Motosune had not bargained for was that the emperor started doing as he grew older, and increasingly frantic efforts required to either direct or conceal it. By his early teenage years, it was clear something was genuinely wrong. The court chronicles the progression in careful, increasingly alarmed detail. It began with animals. The young emperor enjoyed setting dogs against monkeys to watch them fight. He would feed live dogs to snakes so he could watch the reptiles swallow them. These were disturbing pastimes for the ruler of Japan, but they were manageable. Then he began personally executing criminals with his own sword. Then he started chasing courtiers who said things he disliked, reaching for his blade. Motosune tried everything available to him, gentle advice, appeals to duty, and the emperor closed his ears to all of it. Then came an incident that made the decision for him. Motosune arrived at the imperial court one morning to find that Yozei had ordered a group of men to climb high into the trees, then ordered servants to stand below with long sharpened lances and poke at the men in the branches until they fell. This was the emperor's entertainment for that afternoon. Motosune solved the problem with a lie. He told Yozei he had arranged a special horse race, a treat just for the emperor. Yozei was delighted. He climbed into the carriage. The carriage, surrounded by guards, was immediately diverted to a secondary palace outside the capital, where Motosune informed him he was no longer emperor. Yozei was 15 years old and he spent the next 65 years in retirement, the longest post-abdication span in the history of the Japanese imperial family, during which he continued to attack people, killed several more, and was occasionally reported to have vanished into the mountains to chase wild deer and boars. He also did write some poetry, but he died at 80, having spent more of his life deposed than he ever spent ruling, and having shown no meaningful signs of improvement across 6.5 decades of retirement. Number 8. Phalaris, Akragas, Sicily. In the 6th century BCE, the Greek colony of Akragas on the coast of Sicily was one of the most prosperous cities in the ancient Mediterranean. Phalaris governed it. He had come to power the standard way for an ambitious man of his era. He was put in charge of building a temple, armed his construction workers, and then seized the citadel. Once in control, he expanded the city's territory, reformed its agriculture, and built Akragas into a regional power. He was also, by the unanimous account of every ancient writer who ever mentioned him, the most brutally creative tyrant of his age, and the name invoked for centuries afterwards when everyone needed a shorthand for the very worst ruler could be. A sculptor named Paralaus of Athens came to Phalaris one day with a proposal. He had designed and built a device, a hollow bronze bull, life-sized, with a door on its side through which a person could be placed. The door would be sealed and a fire lit beneath the bull. As the metal heated, the person inside would be roasted alive. The device's particular refinement was an acoustic system built into the bull's nostrils, a series of tubes and stops that were designed to convert the screams of the person inside into sounds resembling the bellowing of an actual animal. The death would be public, theatrical, and heard by everyone present, as there's nothing more alarming than a bull lowing in the distance. Paralaus told Phalaris, "Their screams will come to you through the pipes as the tenderest, most melodious of bellowings." Well, Phalaris had a practical question. Did it work? He told Paralaus to get inside and demonstrate. Paralaus complied. Phalaris then locked the door, lit the fire, and then just listened. Before Paralaus could die, Phalaris had him removed, dragged to the top of a cliff, and then thrown off. He didn't want the bull's first death to be wasted on its maker. Phalaris used this bull for 16 years, and then a popular uprising overthrew him. The ancient writers record with barely a concealed satisfaction that Phalaris himself was placed inside the bronze bull and burned to death in it. The screams that came out through the pipes sounded, as designed, like a bull bellowing. The crowd outside knew exactly what they were hearing. Moving on to number 7, Justin II, the Byzantine Empire. Justin II began his reign as Emperor of Byzantium with something close to genuine competence. He paid off state debts, reduced the taxes, and stabilized the imperial finances his uncle Justinian had stretched to the breaking point. His foreign policy was bold, maybe too bold. He canceled tribute payments to hostile neighbors, refused to be extorted by the Avars, and reopened the war with the Sassanid Persians. The Persians responded by invading and capturing Dara, a vital eastern fortress that had been the linchpin of the Byzantine defense in the region. When the news reached Justin in 573, something snapped. By contemporary accounts, the breakdown was immediate. He never fully recovered. Within months, Justin could no longer govern. His wife, the Empress Sophia, took effective control of the empire while her husband came apart around her. The historian John of Ephesus, who lived through the period and wrote about it with evident horror, described the emperor rushing through the palace in terror, screaming like a wild animal, biting anyone who came near him, hiding under his bed, piling himself with pillows, and throwing himself at the windows in an attempt to jump out. Well, the empress had the windows barred. The only intervention that worked was music, organ music specifically. played continuously throughout the palace 24 hours a day, which was the sole thing capable of calming the emperor enough to function. It became the permanent soundtrack of the Byzantine court. In the final years of his reign, Justin was wheeled through the palace corridors on a mobile throne, snapping at the servants who pushed it and biting anyone who came within reach. Sources record with the appropriate caution about the reliability of the claim, though, that he ate 2 of his attendants. Well, what is not disputed is that Sophia ran the empire, that Justin was completely mad, and that he managed, in one final window of lucidity before his death in 578, to deliver a remarkably coherent farewell speech to his successor. "As a man, I have sinned," he said. "As a sinner, I have been severely punished." He pointed to his ministers, "But these men abused my confidence and inflamed my passions, will stand before the tribunal of Christ beside me." That was the most lucid thing he had said in years. If you're enjoying the video, please drop a like and a comment down below. It really does help the channel out. Number 6. Ivan the Terrible, Russia. Ivan IV of Russia earned his nickname the hard way. He was the first Tsar of Russia, a title he created for himself, and in the early years of his reign he was genuinely impressive. He conquered Kazan and Astrakhan, opened trade routes with England, brought the first printing press to Russia, and centralized power in a way no previous Russian ruler had managed. Then his first wife died in 1650. Ivan became convinced she had been poisoned by the boyars, the Russian nobility. No evidence supported this. It didn't matter. From that point, the paranoia that had always lived at the edge of his personality moved into the center, and it never left. He created the Oprichniki, Russia's first secret police, a force of black-robed riders who carried severed dog heads on their saddles as emblems of their loyalty. They were given total immunity from any law and absolute authority to arrest, torture, and execute anyone Ivan suspected of disloyalty. Ivan's treasurer was boiled alive in a cauldron. One counselor was hanged while members of Ivan's court took turns hacking pieces from his body. Boyars were roasted on specially constructed frying pans. In 1570, Ivan became convinced the entire city of Novgorod, Russia's second largest city at the time, was planning to defect to Poland. Now, there's no evidence they were. He sent the Oprichniki away. For 5 weeks, they killed between 2,000 and 15,000 people. Men, women, and children were tied to sleighs and driven into the frozen river. Novgorod never recovered its former status. Then in 1581, Ivan beat his pregnant daughter-in-law during an argument about her clothing. His eldest son and heir, also named Ivan, confronted him about it. In a fit of rage, Ivan raised his iron-tipped staff and struck his son in the head. The prince died 4 days later. Ivan the Terrible wept at his son's coffin. He spent the remaining years of his reign overcome with guilt and grief, banging his head against the floor in prayer, wearing a monk's habit, and begging God for forgiveness. He died in 1584, reportedly mid-move during a game of chess. Russia descended into what historians called the Time of Troubles, a decade of famine, civil war, and chaos in the aftermath. Ivan had built an empire and then systematically destroyed the foundations that it rested on. Number 5. Nero, Rome. Nero became Emperor of Rome at the age of 17. His mother had poisoned her way to getting him to the throne, first marrying Emperor Claudius, then having Claudius poisoned, and for the first several years of his reign, Nero was managed by a small team of advisors who kept the worst of his impulses in check. Then the advisors lost control and the impulses took over. What followed was one of the most comprehensively destructive personal reigns in Roman history, remarkable not just for its cruelty, but for the spectacular variety of ways Nero found to be terrible to almost everyone in his life. He had his stepbrother Britannicus poisoned at dinner. He had his mother, Agrippina, the woman who had engineered his entire rise to power, hunted down and stabbed to death after an attempt to drown her in a collapsing boat failed. He divorced his first wife and had her executed, reportedly sending her severed head as a present to his mistress. Then he kicked his pregnant second wife, Poppaea, to death in a rage. He had his third wife's previous husband executed so he could marry her. As emperor, he performed publicly on stage as a singer and a poet, which is an act considered so degrading for a Roman ruler that audiences were reportedly not allowed to leave during his performances, and some faked their own deaths to escape. When fire swept through Rome in 64 AD, destroying huge sections of the city, Nero blamed the Christians and had them rounded up and executed in the most theatrical way available. Dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, crucified or fastened to stakes and then set alight in his gardens, to serve as a human torch while he paraded among them in a charioteer's costume. He died at age 30, having been declared an enemy of the state by the Senate, chased from Rome by his own guard, and forced to beg his secretary to stab him because he lacked the nerve to do it himself. His last words, according to Suetonius, were, "What an artist the world is losing in me." He meant it. Number 4. Elagabalus, Rome. In the spring of the year 218 AD, an army in Syria declared a 14-year-old boy the Emperor of Rome. His grandmother had started a rumor that he was the illegitimate son of the beloved Emperor Caligula. The resemblance was striking enough that the legions believed it, and before anyone could do much about it, the boy was marching on Rome with an army at his back. His name was Elagabalus, taken from the Syrian sun god he served as high priest, and in 4 years he managed to do more damage to Roman religious and social conventions than any emperor before or after. His first act was to import the sacred black stone of Elagabal, a conical meteorite from Syria, to Rome and install it in a new temple on the Palatine Hill, declaring his god superior to Jupiter. Every summer he paraded the stone through the streets of Rome in a golden chariot, dancing before it himself in the robes of a Syrian priest. He ordered the most sacred religious objects from the temple across the empire transferred to this new temple, subordinating every god in the Roman pantheon beneath his own. He then married a Vestal Virgin, Rome's most sacred priestess, sworn to 30 years of celibacy on pain of being buried alive, claiming the union would produce godlike children. He divorced her, remarried, divorced again, and then married the Vestal Virgin a second time. His most stable relationship was with a charioteer named Heracles, a blonde former slave from Anatolia whom he referred to as his husband and called himself the wife. Ancient historians describe him as wearing wigs and makeup, preferring feminine titles, and, per Cassius Dio, offering enormous sums of money to any physician who could provide him with female anatomy through surgery. At 18, after 4 years of religious scandal, chaotic marriages, and behavior that had alienated the Praetorian Guard, the Senate, and eventually his own grandmother, he was assassinated. His body was thrown into the Tiber River, and the Senate immediately began dismantling every trace of his existence. That meteorite? Yeah, that went back to Syria. Number 3. Caligula, Rome. For the first 7 months, Caligula was everything Rome had hoped for. He freed political prisoners, canceled unfair taxes, hosted spectacular games, and was greeted wherever he went with the kind of genuine popular enthusiasm that his predecessor, Tiberius, had never generated. Then he fell severely ill, and when he recovered, something had changed. By the time the Praetorian Guard stabbed him to death 4 years later, he had declared himself a living god, nominated his horse for the Roman consulship, and built a 3-mile floating bridge across the bay, while dressed in the golden armor of Alexander the Great, specifically to disprove a prophecy that he had no more chance of becoming emperor than riding a horse across open water. He removed the heads from statues of the gods and replaced them with his own. He had senators executed for vague offenses he invented on the spot, and those survived were required to worship him. He declared war on the sea god Neptune, marched his legions to the shore, ordered them to attack the waves with their swords, and then had them collect seashells from the beach as the official spoils of war. His horse, Incitatus, lived in a marble stable, slept on purple sheets and wore a jeweled collar, even drank from a golden cup and was served meals by personal attendants. Caligula invited Incitatus to imperial dinner parties as a guest and, according to the historian Suetonius, announced his intention to make the horse consul, the highest elected office in Rome. Whether he genuinely intended to follow through with that or was making an elaborate point about the Senate's irrelevance, the senators understood the message either way. He lasted 4 years before his own bodyguard stabbed him to death in a corridor, and he was 28. After his death, the Senate voted to have his memory officially erased from Roman records, the same honor, roughly, as not existing. Number 2. Zhengde Emperor, China. The Zhengde Emperor of the Ming Dynasty ascended the throne of China at 14 and then ruled for 16 years, none of which he appeared to want to spend actually governing. His education in Confucian statecraft was thorough and serious. He retained advisors, absorbed the tutoring, performed the appropriate ceremonies, and then left all of it behind the moment the pressure of his father's presence was lifted. What followed was a reign defined by one sustained act of refusal, the refusal to be the Emperor of China, combined with a series of increasingly elaborate and bewildering attempts to be absolutely anything else. He built a fake market district inside his own palace, complete with market stalls and vendors. He then ordered every minister, eunuch, soldier, and servant in the imperial court to dress as merchants and street vendors and staff the fake market while he wandered through it, shopping, pretending to be an ordinary commoner. Anyone who refused, and many did refuse, considering it a humiliating farce beneath their dignity, was punished, demoted, or dismissed. Then there was the Lantern Festival. The emperor decided it would be entertaining to store large quantities of gunpowder in the palace courtyards. The palace caught fire. The blaze burned it to the ground. 30,000 soldiers spent years rebuilding it at a cost of over 1 million taels of silver. He also invented an alter ego, a military commander named Zhu Shou, assumed his identity, and used it to personally lead army campaigns on the northern frontier, abandoning his imperial duties. He fell off a boat while drunkenly pretending to be a fisherman on the Grand Canal in 1520. He contracted an illness from the water that killed him months later at the age of 29. He died without an heir because none of his children had survived childhood. He was succeeded by a cousin. The Ming Dynasty, slowly weakened by 16 years of effective no-show governance, continued its long decline toward eventual collapse. Number 1. Akhenaten, Egypt. Every entry on this list features a ruler who did something insane. Akhenaten did something that's never been done before or since by any ruler of any empire of comparable size and antiquity. He erased the entire religion of a 3,000-year-old civilization and replaced it with one he invented himself. He closed every temple, he dismantled every priesthood, he sent agents across Egypt to chisel the names of gods off existing monuments, not just temples, but private items, scarabs, makeup pots, memorial stones. He outlawed the worship of Amun, Osiris, Horus, and the entire Egyptian pantheon that existed for longer than most other cultures had been civilized. His own birth name, Amenhotep IV, which meant Amun is satisfied, was abandoned. He renamed himself Akhenaten, the sun disk, or the one true god, the only deity permitted to exist in Egypt from that point forward. He then built a new capital in the desert from scratch, on a stretch of the Nile that had never been inhabited, untouched by association with any previous god. The city, Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, grew to house between 20 to 50,000 people at its peak. He built at extraordinary speed using a new style of small, uniform stone. He declared himself the sole intermediary between all of humanity and Aten, the only person through whom the god could be reached. Every Egyptian who wanted to pray had to pray through him. He closed the borders, he redirected huge wealth of the temple economy, which had sustained Egyptian society for millennia, into his new cult. Egypt's foreign allies began to collapse unaddressed. Egyptian generals wrote increasingly desperate letters requesting military support that went unanswered. And Akhenaten continued holding the court in his desert city, worshipping his sun disk and insisting that the revolution was permanent. It was not. He died around the year 1336 BCE, and what followed was one of the most systematic acts of historical erasure ever carried out. His successor, a boy king originally named Tutankhaten, a name compounded with the old forbidden god, immediately changed his name to Tutankhamun, reopened the temples, and began the slow dismantling of everything Akhenaten had built. Later pharaohs went much further. The military commander Horemheb, who became the pharaoh a decade after Akhenaten's death, ordered his temples demolished and their stone blocks reused as filler in newer constructions. His name had been removed from every official king list, not crossed out, but replaced with a blank space or with his predecessor's name, as though his entire reign had simply not happened. The official record jumped from Amenhotep III straight to Horemheb, skipping 17 years without explanation. Ancient scribes refer to Akhenaten only as the enemy from Akhenaten, or that criminal. His city was abandoned completely. Within years of his death, the population left, taking what they could carry and leaving everything else. And then the desert moved in. For over 3,000 years, the sand just covered it up. Akhenaten's name disappeared from human knowledge so thoroughly that even dedicated Egyptologists working through the 18th century had no idea he ever existed, just a gap, an unexplained break in the dynasty. It wasn't until the 1880s when archaeologists uncovering the site at Amarna pieced together the story of what had happened there, and then his name returned to the world. The final irony is this, though. The very thoroughness of the erasure preserved him. Because everyone abandoned Akhenaten so completely and no one returned to build it over, the city lay untouched beneath the sand for millennia. Nefertiti's bust was found in a sculptor's workshop exactly where it had been left the day the city emptied. He's now one of the most studied pharaohs in Egyptian history. Egypt tried to erase him so completely that it accidentally made him immortal.